Hello, everybody. Welcome to this event. I'm Deborah Mabbett, a professor here in the Department of Politics at Birkbeck. I'd first like to extend a warm welcome to... Okay. I'd first like to extend a warm welcome to John McDonnell, Shadow Chancellor, and of course, Birkbeck alumnus. I think the Labour Party is to be congratulated for its initiative in arranging this event, which is part of its New Economics lecture series. Regardless of our individual political views, any academic surely shares a desire to raise the quality of public debate about the central issues that face us, such as inequality. And there can hardly be a person better fitted to do this than Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Few people have made a greater contribution to current debates in political economy. Professor Stiglitz' popular and widely read books on inequality, education, free markets, growth, and globalization rest on an immensely distinguished academic career. Professor Stiglitz's work on the economics of information asymmetry, published in the 1970s, is still widely cited. Indeed, it is being revisited as economists grapple with the lessons of the financial crisis. One might even say that as an academic economist, Professor Stiglitz was somewhat ahead of his time. However, as a public commentator, his insights have been highly pertinent and very timely. So, Professor Stiglitz, it's a great pleasure to welcome you, and John McDonnell will now introduce Professor Stiglitz.
Thanks. Is this microphone working? Good. Let me just give you the background to today, very briefly. As you know, as some of you will know, we've established an economic advisory council to advise the Labour Party on macroeconomic policy, and Joseph volunteered to become one of the members of that council. It's quite broad-ranging. Mariana Mazzucato, Thomas Piketty, the whole range of leading economists that putting their ideas together to advise us and stimulate the debate that we're having within the Labour Party about the future of our macroeconomic policy. That meets on a regular basis, and below that we've set up all these different reviews of the Treasury, HMRC, the Bank of England, the Monetary Policy Committee that Danny Blanchflower is leading. So there's a whole range of others as well that are involved in the discussion about how we develop our macroeconomic policy, how we reform our economic institutions and the overall management of the economy. And that's buzzing at the moment. But what we wanted to try and do is raise the level of debate around economic policy. And so what we've asked our Economic Advisory Council members and others to do is to look at a series of lectures and seminars and conferences. We're going to do an annual conference on the state of the economy. This year we're going to do it in end of May, so lots of you will be invited to that. And what's happening is our members of the Council, Economic Advisory Council, and others are touring around the country doing lectures and seminars, and people are turning up in large, it's a bit worrying, people are turning up in really large numbers. Our first one had 500, and we were turning people away at the door. And it's just been extraordinary how many people want to get engaged in the discussion and the debate. And we're trying to have a whole range of speakers as well. As George Osborne and the Prime Minister pointed out, again, one of our invited speakers is Yanis Varoufakis and Paul Mason and others. So some people will bring along with them ideas of their own. It could be contentious, but we want to engage in that debate as we hammer our policies out in the coming period. It's just been really exciting, to be frank, and it is raising the level of economic, well, maybe not in the House of Commons, but it's raising the level of economic debate generally, I think, across society in what we're doing. I'm really grateful to welcome Joseph. I've got down here just a brief introduction and an optional joke. I'm not allowed to do jokes anymore, and I'm not allowed any props, in particular small books. Let me just... Joseph is the university professor at Columbia University, as you know, a Nobel Prize-winning economist. His most recent book, which is brilliant, is called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy, and is leading the debate around reform of economic policy within the US, and I think is having its impact here. But as you know, he's better known possibly for his groundbreaking book on inequality after which he published The Price of Inequality. Joseph's going to deliver the lecture, and then we're going to open it up for questions as wide range as we possibly can, okay? Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. The subject of inequality is something I've been very engaged in for a very long time. In fact, the reason I gave up studying physics, a really serious subject, to become an economist was of my concern about inequality. And my PhD thesis, the central chapter of that, was on the distribution of income and wealth among individuals. Published, I recommend it to all of you. It's still the best article written on the subject, and I modestly say it. It was published in Econometrica in 1969. But when I a few years ago wrote an article called Of the 1%, For the 1%, and By the 1%. I think you can get a flavor for the subject of that talk. I published it in Vanity Fair, and it got a lot larger readership than my Econometrica article did. So I tell my students, if you want to get readers, publish in Vanity Fair rather than Econometrica. What I want to do today is talk very, very quickly, describe what has been happening to inequality. I'll focus mostly on the United States because I know that data better. I'll have a few charts that describe what's going on in the UK, elsewhere in the world. As in many other things, the US does things bigger and better than elsewhere in the world, and we have more inequality than anywhere else in the world. But UK has been aspiring to match us, and you've been doing reasonably well, but you haven't quite caught up yet. But if you continue going in the direction you have, there is some chance that you can. So I'll give some charts on UK and other countries. What I really want to do, though, is spend some time talking about what are the causes of this, a little bit about what the consequences and what can be done about it. And much of that of that will flow from the analysis of the nature of the inequality. Now, the fact is that there has been, as I say, enormous growth in inequality. The reason that inequality has risen to the top of the political agenda in the United States, in the UK, and many other countries is a very simple one. It's been growing. When I was a graduate student, one of the questions that we focused on was, why was the distribution of income so stable? And we worked very hard to develop theories about why income distribution never changed. And as soon as we finally succeeded in explaining why it didn't change, it started to change. And so all those theories have been thrown out, and that's good for those of you who are now graduate students, because that means you have something to do to find new theories. And some of what I'm going to talk about are some of those new theories. When we talk about inequality, the standard measure, and you'll see it in some of the charts, is the Gini coefficient. But what I want to emphasize is that no single number captures anything of the complexity of the income distribution. And what has been going on in the United States, UK, and other countries, it has multiple dimensions. In terms of just income, there's more money at the top. There are more people in the poverty at the bottom, and there's been an evisceration of the middle class. Much of the discussion about inequality focuses on income inequality, but wealth inequality is much larger, and I'll talk about that very briefly. But there are many other aspects of inequality. In the United States, because we don't have a national health service, we don't recognize the basic right of individuals to have access to medicine, even though it's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The result of that is there are huge inequalities in health. The consequences, I unfortunately won't have time to talk about that, but large disparities across life expectancy among different groups in our society. But just a footnote and a warning of how bad things can go, the life expectancy of key groups of even white males in the United States is in decline. While for the rest of the world, life expectancy is increasing, it's in significant decline. The only time I've seen data like this is after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when there was total chaos in Russia, and you saw a decline in life expectancy. But given the data that I'm going to show you, it'll be understandable what is going on. And of course, there are other things like inequalities in access to justice. Americans every day, young American school kids, at the beginning of every school day have this ritual called Pledge Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And at the end it says, with justice for all. And what we are now saying is, with justice for all who can afford it. Because our system of justice is really being such that if you're poor, you don't get a system of justice. We even in the crisis threw people out of their homes who didn't owe any money. So these are just some charts to try to graphically illustrate what has gone on. The level of inequality right before the Great Recession reached levels that were comparable to those that were reached right before the Great Depression. I grew up in the 1950s, which I didn't recognize, but now we do. It's called the golden age of capitalism. John probably didn't think it was a golden age. I didn't either. I thought there was terrible inequality, unemployment, racial discrimination. But now I recognize that it was actually the golden age. And since then, the top 1% has seized for itself about almost a quarter of income. Now, there's been a lot of concern about what's happened in the UK, and you see this starts much later, so you don't see the other part. But what I want to emphasize that you've had a doubling of the level, the percentage that goes to the top 1%, which is comparable in ratio terms to the United States, but you are still less than half of the United States. So you can get much worse. This chart just emphasizes it is really a story about the top 1%. There's been a lot more stability in the top 10%. And actually, if you looked at the top 1/10 of 1%, it would be even worse. One of the theory, when Mitt Romney was running for president, and he was one of these people in the 1%, when people talked about this growing inequality, he said this was the politics of envy. And he said, well, you know, he enunciated this view that's often called trickle-down economics, that if you everybody benefits because money trickles down from the top. And my response is a little bit, I wish it were true, because if it were true, given how much we've given to the top, everybody else in our society would be doing very well. But in fact, this chart shows that trickle-down economics has not been working, that the median income in the United States today, adjusted for inflation, median is half above, half below, is lower than it was a quarter century ago. But median income reflects an average for society, and different groups are in different situation, and we still have an enormous amount of gender discrimination, but there's been slight decreasing gender discrimination, so that women have done a little bit better than men. If you've been watching the American political debate, and if you're interested in humor, I would recommend you looking at the Republican presidential debates, or if you're interested in getting depressed. But what you see there is evidence of a lot of particularly angry men. And one of the reasons for that is what is illustrated in this next chart. And what that chart shows is that in the middle, incomes of the median income of a full-time male worker today is the same as it was 40 years ago. So that means for 4 decades, men have not seen any increase in their income. This in a country that says every generation is going to be doing better than the next. Well, the only thing that the middle income people can feel good about is that things at the bottom are even worse. If you look at the minimum wage in the United States, the minimum wage in the United States is now lower than it was 60 years ago, which is phenomenal, that the wages of somebody at the bottom in the United States are the same as they were more than a half century ago. Well, the UK in these terms looks somewhat better than the United States. And that is, here's a picture of median household income in the UK, and it was going up until around 2009. And since then, you see it declining. Those are 2 different measures, adjusting for housing costs and not adjusting for housing costs. The minimum wage, though, in the UK has done much better than in the United States. I should comment, 70% of Americans think the minimum wage is too low. The fact that it's lower than it was 60 years ago. This is not a revolutionary idea that you should have some increase in wages over a period of 60 years. But in spite of that, because of our Congress and the Republican-controlled Congress, even though 70% of Americans believe the minimum wage is too low, we cannot get it through Congress. One of the things that has given me a little hope is the fact that there is a broad civil society movement, national movement, to increase the minimum wage. And you see cities throughout the United States, Seattle, San Francisco, New York, Los Angeles, all increasing their minimum wage, typically by doubling it. Now, many of you may know that the United States thinks of itself, and many of you think of the United States as a land of opportunity. It's sometimes called the American dream. And it is a fact that you read about a lot of Americans who've made, or a lot of immigrants to America, who make it from the bottom to the top. So there is some opportunity. People read about it in the newspaper, but the fact that they read about it in newspapers should make you think. Newspapers don't write about things that happen every day. They don't write about dogs that bite people, they write about people that bite dogs. And by the same token, the reason that they write about people who make it from the bottom to the top is that it's very unusual. So what an economist or social scientist means by equality of opportunity is what are the life prospects, what are the probabilities, what are the chances, what is the likelihood. And in those terms, the United States is among the countries around the world with the least equality of opportunity. There's another country that has the same low level of equality of opportunity as the United States, and that's the UK, among the advanced countries. So what I've said in this slide is it's not a surprise, this result, because if you look across countries or even within a country like the United States, there's a systematic relationship between inequality in incomes or outcomes and inequality of opportunity. Not a surprise that when you have a huge disparity in incomes, those at the top give more opportunity to their children. So the next slide shows the relationship that I've just described. On the vertical axis is the standard measure of inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. The bottom, the horizontal axis is the intergenerational earnings mobility. What is the relationship between a parent's earning and a child's earning? And forget about Chile up there. This is the OECD data, and Chile is a member of the OECD, but it's really an emerging market. It's not a developed country. Among the developed countries, the three countries with the highest level of inequality of opportunity are the United States, Italy, and Great Britain. And they are also the three countries with the highest level of inequality. This kind of pattern of a high and growing inequality is something that one sees as one looks across the advanced countries. But I should say it's a trend that's seen almost everywhere, but not everywhere. There are some Latin American countries with high levels of inequality, but they've been bringing them down very markedly. And I'll talk about the implication of that. So this is a Gini coefficient, as I say, the standard measure of inequality. And what you see there is that the United Kingdom is up there. The only other advanced country anywhere near there is the United States. I should mention that this is inequality in income after taxes and transfers. In terms of inequality in market income, the UK actually is even worse performing than the United States. But the United States does nothing about its inequality, whereas the UK does something about it. So that, to make you feel better, you aren't quite as bad as the United States. So this just shows you some of the trends in Gini coefficients, and this looks at various countries, and what you see is almost all the countries have large increases in inequality, but a few countries like France have actually had very little change, and a couple countries, emerging markets, have had a decrease. One interesting exercise is to look at the inequality from a global perspective, looking across the world as a whole, pretending that there were no boundaries, no borders, and arranging people from the bottom to the top, and looking at, over a 2-decade period, how well each of these groups have done. And what you see there is two groups who have done very well. The very rich in the world, which are, for the most part, the very rich in the rich countries. So that was the 1% that I talked about in the beginning, the 1% in the United States, the 1% in the UK. They have seen a 70% increase in their income. And they have seized a very large fraction, I can't remember now the amount, but around a half of all the increase in global income. So if you have a choice about who your parents would be, these are the people that you should choose to have as your parents. The other group that has done very well, in percentage terms, the other peak is around the 50th percentile, and those are the middle classes in the emerging markets in China. These are the emerging middle classes in the emerging markets, and they've done very well. You notice that two groups have done very poorly. The bottom always do poorly, and they've done poorly. But the other group is at the 80th percentile. And those are the middle or the lower middle class in Europe and America. And they have had stagnant income. So that tells you a lot about the concern in Europe and America about inequality. The reality is these have been the losers over a long time. The numbers, the charts that I just described provide a set of new understandings of inequality, plus a number of other studies, and I want to describe them very, very briefly. The first, I've already said, is trickle-down economics doesn't work. But what I want to highlight here is how deeply ingrained the idea of trickle-down economics is, even in administrations like the Obama administration. So when they came to deal with the crisis of 2009, what did they do? They saved the banks, and the argument was by saving the banks, it would benefit, the benefits would trickle down to everybody in our society. They believed in trickle-down economics, they really did. The Fed believed in trickle-down economics. It said if we had QE, we get the stock market price up, the wealthy will be very well off, they'll spend money, and that will trickle down to all the rest. Didn't happen. In fact, in the first 3 years of the recession, 91% of all the increase in income in the United States went to the top 1%. So trickle-down economics didn't work. The second big idea is what we call repeal of Kuznick's law. Kuznick was a great economist in the middle of the 20th century who argued that in the early stages of development, there's a growth in inequality. You see this today in China. The parts of society that are able to take advantage of the new opportunities grow faster than others, and they pull ahead. And so there's a growth of inequality. But then eventually, the others catch up. So early on, there's a growth of inequality, and then inequality comes down. And that was the pattern in the United States. You see that at the time Kuznick was writing. It had gone up, and then it had come down. But of course, no economist sees the world with the crystal ball. And the question, and he didn't see what was going to happen beginning around 1980. The enormous increase of inequality over the last third of a century. So that has presented, in many ways, the biggest challenge for economics, the biggest challenge for both economic policy and economic theory. What happened? Why did that golden age of capitalism in the 50s and 60s give way to the inequality that has marked the last third of a century? Now, there are different theories. And let me just sort of digress here about what those, a couple of those different theories are. One of the theories was that it's just market forces, demand and supply, and they played out in very strange ways that lead to more inequality. And these have to do with skill bias, technical change. The technical change increases the productivity of highly skilled people relative to less skilled people. Globalization, which has integrated 2 billion people from emerging markets into the global labor force and therefore increased the supply of unskilled labor relative to skilled labor and therefore depressed the unskilled labor. So these are examples of ordinary workings out of demand and supply. But there's some compelling arguments against that as an explanation. And it's an explanation that was held very strongly by many economists until the last few years. It's now becoming abandoned. The first reason that argument I find unpersuasive goes back to an observation I made at the beginning of this talk, which is the laws of economics are universal. Demand and supply, those forces operate on both sides of the Atlantic, in the north and the south of Europe. But the outcomes in terms of the level and changes in the level of inequality have played out very, very differently. There are some countries with much more market inequality than others. Scandinavian countries, Canada, have much less inequality. In market income, let alone after tax and transfer, but market income than the UK, Germany. And that says it's not the laws of demand and supply. It's not economic forces. It's not inevitable and inexorable economic force. It's the result of policies. It's the way we structure the market economy. Markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets are structured by laws and regulations, and the way they're structured affects the degree of inequality. And that is actually the central message of the book, Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy. So our thesis was a very different thesis. It was that beginning around the time of Thatcher and Reagan, we began rewriting the rules of the market economy. That what we were told, the argument was put forward, that if we only lower tax rates, particularly at the top, it would incentivize people to work harder, to invest more. And if we liberalized the economy, we would open up the space for people to do more. And the combination of liberalization and incentivization, lower tax rates, would unleash a new economic growth. And yes, there would be more inequality, but it would be shared differently. There would be more inequality, but the growth of the economy would be so much higher that even those at the bottom and the middle would be better off. So yes, there would be more inequality, but everybody would get a bigger piece of pie. Not a bigger share, but a bigger piece of pie. So nobody should complain. Well, it hasn't turned out that way. We now have a third of a century of this experiment on both sides of the Atlantic. So we're not making a judgment on the basis of 1 or 2 years. We're making a judgment on the basis of a third of a century. And what we can say after that, a third of a century, is it has failed. The bottom 90% of Americans have seen no increase in their income, no significant increases in their income. All the increase has gone to the top 10%. As I showed you, at the very bottom, wages are lower than they were 60 years ago. So we can declare this as a failed experiment. And then the challenge is to say, okay, we rewrote the rules of the market economy then to make our economy more unequal. And it turned out to make it grow more slowly. Now we have to rewrite the rules once again. And this time, to rewrite the rules, and learning from what we've learned from that failed experiment, this time to have faster economic growth, but this time to have shared prosperity. So I don't have time to really go through all the items in the agenda, but let me just mention a couple to sort of highlight some of the fundamental change in our economic perspective. One of the things that have gone wrong in our economy is the growth of short-termism, that firms are focused on the next quarter. Many of our stock market firms are focused on the next nanosecond. Now, you can't invest in people, for technology, in machines, for long-term economic growth if you're focused on the nanosecond or even in the next quarter. The result of this kind of short-termism is that, in fact, the functioning of our economy is markedly different than is described in the typical textbook. The typical textbook describes the financial market as intermediating between savers on the one hand and firms that are investing on the other. So the financial sector takes savings from the household sector translates it to the investment in firms. That hasn't described the American economy for a very long time. What has been going on is the financial sector is a mechanism to take money out of the corporate sector. So, in the last couple of years, a couple percentage of GDP has been distributed to shareholders in share buybacks. There's been no flow of money from the household sector to the corporate sector. So all those models about banking intermediating between the household and the corporate sector are just false. They don't describe modern capitalism. But of course, then the harder question is, what were exactly the rules that led to this short-termism? And what we try to do is, in this book, is describe what were the rules. What were the rules of the legal decisions that said what the obligations of firms were, the tax system that induced people, corporate governance that restricted what the corporations could do and gave scope for CEOs to take a larger and larger share of the corporate pie. So that's one example. As another example is the functioning of the Federal Reserve. Here, our Federal Reserve officially has a much better mandate than the Bank of England and a much, much better mandate than the ECB. The ECB, as you know, focuses only on inflation. And the Federal Reserve has a mandate to look at not only inflation, but employment, growth, inflation, and financial stability. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, one of the Republican senators said he wanted to change the mandate of the Federal Reserve to focus just on inflation. And I said, oh, this is great. Let's go to American people and say, do they care about jobs? And we'll run an election campaign on the mandate of the Federal Reserve. Well, as soon as the president made clear that he would fight over this issue, the Republicans said, oh, that was just a joke. That wasn't serious. We really do care about jobs. But in practice, the Federal Reserve has focused less on jobs than on inflation. And the result of that is that they've contributed to the ratcheting down of wages over time. Every time wages start going up, they say we have to tighten the Federal Reserve, we have to tighten monetary policy, and that means that wages are dampened. But you see it even in, as I mentioned before, the trickle-down philosophy, which has been so dominant. You know, I've been critical of QE. People say, well, what else could it have done? Well, other ways of thinking about what a central bank's responsibility would have led to other views. If you said a central bank should be concerned about the flow of credit, access to credit to businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises, so that you can create opportunity and growth, that would be very different from what the Fed has done. What they did is they pumped money into the economy, but the money went into creating credit bubbles, creating stock market increases, to creating problems in the emerging markets, but not into increased lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, which years after the 2008 crisis was still well below the 2007-8 level. So yes, they increased liquidity, but it didn't reach the people that it needed to reach. That's one aspect. But another example is the Fed has a very large regulatory role. One of the reasons that there's so much anger in the United States right now is not only that there is a lot of inequality, but there is a sense that a lot of the inequality is unfair, and that the political system perpetuates this inequality. I mentioned a little earlier that inequality of wealth is greater than inequality in income. And I highlight that one single number sort of captures what has happened in the United States. 8 Americans from 2 families who did have the wisdom to choose the right parents, so they inherited their money, have as much wealth as the bottom 44% of our country. So they have as much wealth as about 150 million people. That's testimony to how much wealth there is at the top, a few people at the top, and how little wealth there is at the bottom. But these people are playing an enormous role in our political process. There's a whole book written about 2 of these people, of how the role that they played in our political process. And the Supreme Court has said you can have unlimited campaign spending. But the unfairness relates to this power is used to shape the regulatory environment. The Fed, I mentioned before, part of the reason of anger is a sense of unfairness. The banks caused the crisis, but nobody from the financial sector, almost nobody, has been held accountable. The banks have been convicted, agreed that they agreed that they committed massive fraud. Massive fraud. But interestingly, the fraud was committed, but nobody committed the fraud. There are no individuals that committed the fraud. It just happened. So nobody could be convicted. Now, these are some of the reasons why there's a lot of anger in the country. But going back to the responsibility of the Fed has a regulatory responsibility, and one of the regulations that they were entrusted with implementing was the regulation having to do with charging for what are called interchange fees, fees that are charged to businesses when you use a debit card or a credit card. Now, modern technology has been great. Modern technology allows for the transfer of money from your bank account to the bank account of a merchant when you go in and buy a commodity, buy a coffee, or buy anything, okay? How much should that cost? That movement of electrons cost a fraction of a penny. How much do they charge? 1, 2, 3%. We're talking about, the wonderful thing about this is penny here and penny there. Pretty soon you're talking billions, tens of billions of dollars. So this is a tax that banks impose on every transaction that goes on, or almost every transaction, because increasingly they're debit or credit card financed, in our societies, on both sides of the Atlantic. But it's a tax that goes to enrich the coffers of the bank, not for public purpose. And the banks are resisting doing anything about it. Finally, we succeeded in Dodd-Frank to get a provision called the Durbin Amendment, but we made a mistake. We entrusted the Federal Reserve to implement this. And the Federal Reserve staff made a recommendation that was twice as high as it should have been. But then the Fed saying, we don't want to be, have too sharp of a pencil, they gave a number that was twice that their own staff had recommended. And the judge who looked at this said, this is absurd. But it is the ruling that went forward. So basically, they have embedded in the rules of the game set by the Federal Reserve, run by the banks, for the banks, fees that you pay every time you go purchase a product. If you want to increase inequality, this is way. It's money that goes from ordinary citizens to the bankers. Well, what I've tried to describe is the overall increase in inequality, how we got it, One of the important aspects of our new understanding of inequality is that it has very serious consequences for the functioning not only of our democracy, in the way I describe, not only for the functioning of our society, creating a more divided society, but even for more narrowly defined the functioning of our economy. Now, this is a view that you might expect to come out of a, sort of a left-wing economist. And I'm not a left-wing economist, I'm a middle-of-the-road economist. But you might have thought of that kind of view coming out of a left-wing economist. But what I want to emphasize is this is now mainstream view. It was the view that I articulated in my book, The Price of Inequality, but it's a view now that's been echoed in OECD reports, IMF, International Monetary Fund. For those of you who don't know it, International Monetary Fund is not a reputed left-wing organization. If anything, it reflects the interest of financial markets. And for a whole variety of reasons, we now understand that a more divided society with more inequality has more instability, grows more slowly, doesn't function in every way as well as a more cohesive society. We're not talking about here creating complete equality. What we're talking about is the extremes of inequality to which the United States and many other advanced countries, including the UK, have gone. So let me just conclude and go back to the thesis about what is the origins of this inequality. The origins, as I say, is the way we rewrote the rules beginning a third of a century ago. When we began that experiment, one might have asked, if Reagan or Thatcher had gone, Reagan had come to the American people and said, I have this great idea, this reform. Everybody's in favor of reforms. I have this great idea, this great reform, the result of which is that the economy is going to grow more slowly, but don't worry about it. All the growth that does occur will go to the top 10%. And if you happen to be so poorly informed that you choose to be on the bottom 90%, you're going to see stagnant. If you choose to be in the bottom 50%, you're going to see your income decline. Would the American people have voted for that idea? That was supposed to be a rhetorical question. It wasn't a test on an exam. So some of you looked like you were puzzled. Well, the answer is, I think everybody would have said no. But that was not the question that was ever asked. What happened was, it was said, here are some ideas. You might say they were reasonable. I didn't think they were reasonable at the time, but you could have said they're reasonable. When things didn't quite work out in the way that was hoped, what happened is they doubled down on the experiment. They said, we have to try it a little bit more. You haven't given it a full chance. It's sort of like medieval bloodletters. When you let a lot of blood and the patient often didn't get better, the bloodletter, what did the bloodletter do? He would say, oh, we haven't let out enough of the blood. Some of the bad humors are still there, and they let out more blood. Now, there are some who even today want to continue that bloodletting process. I think if you did that, it's likely that the patient will eventually die. Or at least there will be enormous divisions and turmoil in our society, in our economy. So the answer, I think, is very simple. We have to recognize that we made a mistake a third of a century ago. And we have to now embark on the very difficult course of rewriting the rules. This book is about the American economy, but there is a similar agenda of rewriting the rules of the British UK economy and of the European economy, rewriting the rules in a way that will return these economies to economic growth and return these economies to shared prosperity. Thank you.
That's terrific. We'll open up to questions. I think we've got a roving mic somewhere, haven't we?
I've got it.
Oh, well done, Joe. Okay. Right, do you want to come in?
Okay. Where's the first one?
Yeah, just along.
Hi, thanks for a great speech. I'm interested in the policies that governments could pursue to sort of reverse this trend in inequality. Do you think that a financial transactions tax would have a positive impact regarding inequality and ending short-termism? And also, given the fact that the majority of European economies, and major European economies, including Germany and France, are going ahead with an FTT, couldn't a Labour government do the same without the involvement of the USA?
Yeah, I think FTT, the financial transaction tax, could raise both substantial amounts of money and probably would be a important ingredient in moving the economy away from short-termism. A well-designed financial transaction tax would discourage the kind of high-frequency trading, the short-termism, because it's a tax that you pay every time you make a transaction. So if you make a transaction 1 billion times a second, you're going to pay that tax a lot. If you buy something and you hold it on for 5 years or 10 years, then that tax becomes trivial. You don't even notice it. So it's specifically a tax effectively on short-term trading. Now, the hardest question in judging the desirability of the financial transaction tax, I think, has been on the question of, you might say, the feasibility, if it's only done in some countries and not others, the extent of circumvention. I've become convinced that a well-designed tax could be implemented without universal cooperation. And I think when people I've talked to in Europe and France and Germany have come to that conclusion as well. I've talked to people who are very good at circumvention, hedge funds. And because, you know, these are the guys who would be circumventing if it could be circumvented. And they have said that they believe it could be constructed so it would not be circumvented. So that gives me some assurance. But that having been said, it is important that one thinks very carefully about the design, because the other side will be working very hard to circumvent. So it will be something that will have to be very, very carefully thought through.
There's a few people on this row. The lady here.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that. I just wanted to ask actually 2 very quick questions. One is about the role of women in terms of the stagnation. When you talk about the stagnation of household income, that of course when you compare it with, say, the 1960s, the big difference is that there's at least two wage earners now. And when you think what that means in terms of the hours that people work and the increase in hours that people have worked over the last 30 or 40 years, I'd like you to comment on that and how that adds to the frustration with inequality. The other question is about TTIP and the plans for this agreement on trade. To what extent do you think this will make it very, very difficult for a left-wing government in this country or anywhere else to be able to implement public ownership, all sorts of other things, defence of the health service and those questions?
So on the first question, I'm glad you raised that, because when I said median income, I showed how stagnant it was. That gave a much too optimistic view of what was going on, because that stagnation in median income came on the face of significant increases in hours worked for the typical household. And so yes, that hiding behind those numbers is the fact that there's a lot more stress. Now, there are 2 other aspects of your question, of that part of the question I wanted to talk about. The first is that it shows that there are many ways in which, by rewriting the rules, one could both get greater women participation in the labor force, do something about inequality, And it shows how there are, as I say, many, many rules of the game that we don't even think about playing a very big role in our inequality. So for instance, let me talk about the United States. We don't have family leave policy. We don't even have sick leave policy. We are one of the few, I mean, I think there are a couple of other, North Korea maybe, or, you know, that are in the same league as the United States. But that makes it difficult for women to participate in the labor force. We don't provide any child care. We have school systems where the school day has nothing to do with the work day. You know, we could rearrange the school day. That's not hard. So these are all examples of the way we organize our society, which is part of the rules. Or to take take another example, we could pass laws that encourage, incentivize, or require more flexibility in the labor market. Because one of the things that contributes to women not dropping out of the labor market is lack of flexibility. Because we still have a social structure in which certain burdens are unequally shared. So that's an important part of rewriting the rules, that kind of gender inclusion. But the other part that we talk a lot about is that there are other groups in our society, in American society, African Americans, that have been excluded. And our rules haven't done enough to prevent discrimination, to prevent denial of access to justice. And, you know, the United States has a problem of mass incarceration. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the people in prison. And unlike other countries, when you get out of prison, you're a felon and you can't get a job. And we've done, you know, clear evidence. Again, changing the rules could make that kind of discrimination more difficult. So the rules of exclusion and inclusion are part of rewriting the rules that have a very big effect on inequality. Let me talk about the trade agreement, TTIP. To me, this is the most massive rewriting of the rules behind closed doors that has ever occurred. The most invidious part of it is the investment agreement. They sometimes call it ISDS, but that's only it's the investor state dispute resolution mechanism. But the danger of TTIP, let me just say, we don't know at this point what the agreement, because it's still under negotiation. But if it comes out looking like TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the USTR is trying to get it to look like, we know what TPP looks like, and no democracy should ever support anything that looks like TPP. And you know, those are strong words, but it's really true. They would make any government that passes a regulation that has an adverse effect on the profits of a company can be sued. And the lawyers who have to draft this wonderful piece of legislation on the behalf of the corporations in secret said, we designed it and to make sure that if you passed a regulation trying to prevent plutonium in baby cereal, we would sue. So this is not a joke. It was so invidious, so serious, and the problems are so problematic, you know, so serious, that the health groups got very concerned because Uruguay and Australia were being sued by Philip Morris because they passed regulations saying that you had to label, not to label cigarettes as dangerous for your health. And guess what happened? Once you had that labeling, people reduced their smoking. They worked, and that was the reason they had those regulations, right? So Philip Morris is suing on the grounds that that has cost them lost profits. And the cost of this litigation is so high that Uruguay cannot pay for it, cannot afford it. So fortunately, we have in America, someone of the 1% who care about these issues. So Mayor Bloomberg is paying for Uruguay's defense. So, but can you imagine that a poor country can't afford to, defend itself against Philip Morris? Now, in TPP, that was, people were so angry about this, and one of the senators said, if you have that in, I can't vote for it. So they had a carve out of cigarettes. But any other kind of regulation, climate, any health, anything else, you can sue. So think about, let's say we had TPP in place, or TTIP in place, and somebody discovers that asbestos is bad for your health, which, it is. Okay. Under the current legal framework, the asbestos manufacturers were sued, and they had to pay for the damage to the health that they had caused. Under TPP, the asbestos manufacturers would sue the government, and we would have to pay, we the taxpayers, would have to pay to make sure, to say to the asbestos manufacturers, you cannot kill people. It's a massive change of property rights. It's a massive change of writing the rules with no public discussion. No public discussion. And the dangers to our society are, literally very significant. So they carved out cigarette smoking in TPP, cigarette regulation in TPP, left everything else in. Congress said, some in the Democratic Party said, we want to make sure that there's something about climate change, at least. The Republicans said no. So it was a deliberate decision to leave climate change regulations in, within the ambit that they can be sued. If you regulate against climate, against greenhouse emissions, you can be sued. So I hope that answered my feelings about this issue.
Hi, I'm Rob Hutton from Bloomberg, here on behalf of the sort of benevolent 0.1%. A lot of what you were talking about focused on the 1%. I'd like to ask John a question, if I may. The previous Labour settlement, the new Labour settlement, as it were, was that the government wasn't interested in making David Beckham poorer. Wasn't interested in making J.K. Rowling poorer. Will a future Labour government have to take a different attitude to that? Because that's who you're talking about when you start.
Yeah. I think the whole purpose of the debate around policy at the moment is how we create the rules to make society more fairer and more just. And I think part of our process in that is looking at ideas around our taxation system in particular, to how we achieve that, but also how we look at the rules and regulations that govern our trading system as well. Some of the focus that we'll be having is around how we earn as a society, and how those earnings then are distributed fairly. And I think that we're opening up that debate again, not with a blank sheet of paper, because we have our own moral judgments about the distribution of income and wealth in this country, but to look at ideas about how we can make a more just and fairer society overall. And we're at that first stage of doing that.
I can't answer the future of the Labour Party, but let me talk a little bit about one of the aspects of economics that I didn't have a chance to talk about. I began to describe alternative theories about what is going on. There's still one more theory I didn't have time to talk about, which is that of Piketty, which has to do with the increase in wealth-income ratio and the fact that with that increase in wealth income ratio, the capitalists who are their income is going up relative to the rest of what is going on. There are a number of reasons that I find Piketty's analysis of the movement and distribution of income, while it has some truth in it, unpersuasive as an overall explanation, is that it doesn't address one important fact, which is that for the United States, beginning about 35 years ago, productivity continued to go up, but wages stagnated. So that's in the labor market. It's not capital, it's labor market. So if you look about historically, wages and productivity move together. They just go up. I have a chart I can show, just go up in tandem. But beginning around a little bit before 1980, productivity continues to grow, not quite as fast, but compensation stagnates. The question is what is going on, and what I think is going on, it has to do with the rules. Now, if you took the straightforward interpretation of Piketty's analysis, if wealth were going up relative to income, and you interpreted wealth as capital, that would mean the society is richer, has more capital, is more productive because of technical change, and it would seem any competitive economic theory, anything that you taught in your basic economics course would say wages ought to be going up. What is going on? Basic idea is a very simple one. Wealth and capital are totally different concepts. Wealth is going up, capital is actually going down relative to income. What is the difference between wealth and capital? The difference between wealth and capital is the capitalized value of rents. So you know about all this very well here in London. The value of land is going up. Do you have more land because you have more valuable land? No. If the price of land in Southampton or in Riviera goes up, the wealth goes up as we measure it. But capital stock could be going down. And if you actually look at the data, that is actually what's been happening relative to income. The capital income ratio has been going down even though its wealth income ratio is going up. So what is going on? Well, I say this, the wedge between the two is the capitalized value of rents. Land rents are the most obvious example. We can see that. But there are also monopoly rents. There are rents that people get by exploitation of other consumers or exploitation of the government. So the banks, when they get a bailout, the present discounted value of the bailout rents is capitalized in the stock market. So wealth goes up. It looks like the society is wealthier. It's not. Citizens' wealth has gone down. PDV, the present discounted value of their future taxes, has gone up. But we don't record that. We only record the value of the stock market. If you have more monopoly power, stock market wealth goes up, but the real income of workers goes down. So this alternative theory that I've explained, where we have among the problems is less effective enforcement of antitrust laws, abuses of corporate governance, problems in the exploitation of the government's public sector, exploitation of consumers. All of that shows up as more wealth, but actually a more poorly performing economy. Now this goes back to the question that you posed about where labor might wind up, and I don't want to put any words in their mouth, but it's not a question of taking wealth away from some of the wealthy, but some of this wealth would not be there if we had better regulatory system, if we had effective antitrust laws.
So your distinction is between the deserving and the undeserving rich?
Well, I would Yeah, in effect, yes. But what I want to say is I don't want to make that judgment. I'm not making the judgment about who is in one category or another. What I'm saying is let's have the rules of the game to create the market economy that those on the right say we already have, but the reality is we know we don't have. Is that?
Yes.
Hi, Hazel Sheffield from The Economist. From The Independent. Really confusing. You're The Economist, I'm from The Independent. So in April, George Osborne is introducing his national living wage, which is still lower than the Living Wage Foundation says we need to live on in the UK. It's going to be £7.20 an hour only for the over 25s. And there's been some interesting stats this week about the number of people who will lose their jobs because firms can't afford to pay this. Do you think this is a good thing, that he's raising the minimum wage in this country? Is it going far enough? And the second question also, I think the debate is heating up on universal basic income this year especially. There's been increasing discussion of it. Is that something that you support, and how does it fit into other things like the minimum wage?
Yeah. So I haven't looked at the numbers for the UK. In the case of the United States, there have been, dozens and dozens of studies on the consequences of the increase in the minimum wage. Now, admittedly, given the chart I show you, we're starting from a very low base. But the overwhelming evidence is that there would be no significant decrease and a possible increase in employment. So, the CBO did a range of studies, looked at it did a meta study of all the studies. The evidence is pretty overwhelming that the best studies, the studies that are most carefully formulated, show no negative and possibly a positive effect of an increase in the minimum wage. That has to do in part with the fact that we are a country with a lack of aggregate demand, and we're beginning with a very low minimum wage. There are other tools in the toolkit if you begin to worry about the loss of employment. Okay, so to me, I think that there needs to be that kind of a discussion based on the circumstances of the UK. And let me one of the other tools in the toolkit is the earned income tax credit. In the United States, we increased the compensation, the wage of those at the bottom by 40%. So what we want to do is encourage people to work, and we say we don't want to discourage the loss of jobs. So what we do is the government effectively matches the employer and pays 40%, increases the income by 40%. The key issue on the universal wage is the budget constraints on the government. So, in general, I have a preference for universal programs, like Social Security, our retirement program. But in a world where there are very severe budgetary constraints, there are some advantages of targeted programs, because you have a very severe budget constraint. So, if Switzerland, a rich country, you might say their circumstances are different than the UK is today. So, given the UK circumstances, I think one can make a compelling case that probably one should probably think more carefully about targeted programs that hit those that are specifically in need rather than universal. But that's the basic trade-off, given the constraints on the budget constraints facing the public sector.
Thank you.
Hi, Hi, I'm Karen Jeffrey from the New Economics Foundation. Really excellent talk, thank you very much. I wanted to ask, we're seeing more and more in the media about the threat that technological developments are posing to jobs, so-called technological unemployment. And in particular, I'm hearing a lot of people saying that's going to be really terrible news in terms of inequality, as middle-income jobs are even more carved out and low-skill, low-wage jobs are lost. So just wanted to hear if you have any thoughts on what might be coming in terms of that, and any ideas on how we might address the inequality issues.
Yeah, as an economist, I think we should be aware that forecasting is always difficult, especially of the future. So I think the concerns about technological unemployment are serious. I spent a lot of time talking to the techno-optimists in Silicon Valley, and they all believe that somehow our new era will be able to create new jobs, just like at the turn of the 20th century, we had cars replaced blacksmiths, destroyed jobs, but more jobs were created than jobs destroyed, and we will go through that same thing. So technology doesn't have to destroy jobs, and that's the experience that we had. The new technologies are markedly different from the old technologies, and so that previous historical experience may or may not be relevant to the new advances that we have. I think what worries me is, let me put it like this, if we had a well-designed and functioning economy and politics, I think these advances in technology unambiguously could increase our standards of living. There's no reason, we've reduced the number of hours on average that people work. In the 17th century, poor farmers had to work very long hours under harsh conditions just to meet the basic needs of life. We don't have to do that anymore. We have a much shorter work week. We could have even a shorter work week. We could have this kind of shared prosperity where a few people might work longer hours if they wanted to, but a lot of people would have more leisure to do what they want. They might even come to lectures like this. So you could imagine that kind of world as evolving, and one in which we have systems of social protection to make sure that the new prosperity, the benefits of that, were widely shared. What worries me is that that's not the kind of politics and economics we have today. And that under our current regime, if we don't change the rules in ways that promote this, we could wind up with precisely the situation where we have high levels of technological unemployment and a continuation of the evisceration of the middle class, much worse than what we've had. And if I were to make a bet, what is the most likely outcome? I'm afraid that that's it, unless we really begin to recognize that this is a possibility, that we can't just rely on market forces to solve the problem on their own, because they won't. And unless we have some concerted efforts to deal with this, the prospects, the adverse prospects you described could actually be realized.
One final question, just in front of you, Joe.
I'm Johnny Lewandowski from the Politics Department at Birkbeck. My question is a very basic one, but I just have to ask it, which is, can the levels of inequality that have built up actually be reversed by regulations through the tax and benefits system, which quite a lot of people say they cannot? Or is it necessary to do something more than that? And what would more than that be, given that you've shown very well how those people who are perhaps the undeserving rich and know exactly who they are very, very capable of setting the terms of argument and continuing and making sure that it continues to be set in the way that they want.
Yeah. So first, I mean, let me say, I think that there is a serious problem in all of our democracies with this nexus between political and economic inequality. That is to say, especially in the United States, where politics is so affected by money, economic inequality translates into political inequality, and that political inequality then translates back into more economic inequality. There's a vicious circle, and breaking into that is extraordinarily difficult. The election, there are a couple of things that give me a little bit of hope. I mentioned before the movement, the local movements we call 5 for 15, raising minimum wage in many cities across the United States. It gives me hope that something can actually be done. The fact that some of the primary candidates have raised, one of the candidates raised, more than $100 and some million and had to drop out. All that money was not enough to even get him beyond early stages of the primary. So money is important, but money isn't everything. So that gives me a little hope. I don't want to say too much. Now, can the inequality be reversed? So let me say a remark I made before. We're not talking about the full elimination of inequality. That's not going to happen. And most economists would say that you need some inequality to provide some incentives. The real concern is the extremes of inequality that have emerged in the United States and Western Europe, which divide our society, undermine our democracy, and impair the functioning of our economy. I think we can do a lot about those extremes of inequality. And that goes back to the point, I think we can rewrite the rules if we can overcome some of the political problems I described before. Now, it is the case, again, as I showed in my chart, that there is a high level of intergenerational transmission of inequality. That was the coefficient between the parent's income and the child's income. And in the UK, it's higher than in almost any other country. That is a major problem. And once you recognize it as a problem, one has to really think about what policies can reduce that intergenerational transmission of inequality. One of them is having a good state-run education system. It's probably the most important. If you look at the statistics of what is the source of the intergenerational transmission, education is probably the number one. But that includes access to higher education. And I know in the United States very, very clearly that the way we fund higher education is a major impediment to equality of opportunity. The average student is graduating with a debt of $25,000. It's not income contingent debt as in the UK. So it is a real albatross around their neck. But if you want to get any advanced degree, many students are graduating with $200,000 debts. And that affects their behavior, their choice of career. It affects their ability to live up to their aspirations. It's even affecting now their ability to start a family, own a home, even own a car. And it's beginning to have macroeconomic effects. There was just an article this week, I think on Monday in the FT, about the $1.2 trillion student debt, which is now larger than credit card debt or any other category of debt, except for mortgages. So, and again, to talk about rewriting the rules, the United States, this illustrates the invidious ways that rules get changed when people aren't noticing. our banks succeeded in changing our bankruptcy law when nobody was looking to say that students can never, or almost never, discharge their debt even in bankruptcy. So if you borrow to buy a yacht and things turn out bad, you can go bankrupt and discharge that debt. If you borrow to get ahead in life and things turn out bad, you can't. It's a noose around your neck for your entire life. And when I've gone around the country talking about this book and my earlier books, The Price of Inequality and The Great Divide, the issue that gets raised to me by young people, by students, over and over again is this issue. And it's even worse than that. I mean, I can't describe how bad things are. Parents come up and say, my kid died in an accident, my kid died of cancer, and I co-signed the note, and I cannot discharge this debt, even in bankruptcy. So this gives you the way, when nobody is looking, the financial sector and others have rewritten the rules for the benefit of a few to make money trickle up to the top from the bottom, and created a very divided society, really destroying opportunity. So I talk about that as an illustration, but our legal framework, our economic framework is riddled with things like that. So, you know, no, we can't create a fully equal society, and the legacy of the past will be with us. But we can get rid of these things overnight if we came to understand them. And that would do a lot to create a more equal society, and one in which there is much more opportunity than there is today.
Can I thank people for coming along, but can I thank especially Joseph Stiglitz for that brilliant lecture. Thank you very much. There's a series of these lectures and seminars going on all around the country. Go onto the Labour Party's website, you'll see the dates and the venues for them. In addition to that, as I say, we're doing an annual conference on the state of the economy at the end of May. Again, that will be advertised on the Labour Party website. Please come along. And again, all of these discussions are open to literally everybody. And we've had a whole mixture of people, business representatives, trade unions, students, academics, others, just people off the street. And it really is, as you've found today, I think, really stimulating and setting an agenda of discussion for us that will eventually, for us from the Labour Party, hopefully eventually arrive at a series of policies that will address some of the key issues facing our society. Thanks for coming along. I'm really grateful. Thank you. Yeah, there's just going to be a Q&A thing for someone leaves you.